Hello, everyone. This is the 147th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. Unfortunately, Mr. Paul Whittle from the 1888 Letter blog could not make it this time. For this episode, I interview English football fan Mr. Chris Bays as we discuss the Roy Evans era as Liverpool manager from 1994 to 1998. Mr. Bays has been on the podcast on a number of occasions discussing the history of Liverpool Football Club. Hello, Chris. Welcome back.
Yeah, hi Sean. Morning. Good morning. Thanks for having me back on. I think this one, the memories will be a bit clearer because they'll be like sort of my era, as it were, when I was starting to kind of go to the games and sort of take everything in. So yeah, I'm looking forward to this one.
Let's go back in time. Can you present the state of the affairs at Liverpool in late January 1994 upon the end of the Graham Souness era as manager?
Well, like the Souness era, like we talked about in the previous podcast, it had represented something of like a break in tradition because he was the first manager Liverpool had appointed from outside of the boot room. Obviously, he'd played for the club, been part of Liverpool's success, but it did represent something of a break in sort of tradition. I think Souness admits now himself that he probably tried to do too much too quickly in terms of like the changes he tried to implement. So he'd obviously seen a different way of kind of preparation and what have you when he was playing in Italy, and he tried to sort of implement a lot of those things and encountered, more than a little bit of resistance, I think, from kind of some of the old guard in terms of the playing staff, but also the coaching staff as well. The appointment of Roy Evans, it was very much like a back to basics kind of appointment, trying to, I think, sort of rekindle past glories and sort of reconnect the club with what had served it so well in the previous sort of 20 years. Roy Evans himself had been like a lifelong like servant to Liverpool, firstly as a player, but then he'd kind of obviously served as like sort of a coach and physio, I think, as well at one point. So I think he obviously understood the club inside out. Yeah, when the patience ran out with Souness, I think he was sort of entrusted as a sort of safe pair of hands to try and restore what had gone before.
Can you describe the trajectory of Roy Evans as a player?
He was an outstanding youth player. Like I read in like my mate Simon Hughes' book, Men in White Suit, there's a chapter that Roy Evans is interviewed, and he'd been kind of like an England youth player, played for Bootle Boys. He'd been very good as a youth player, but I think he didn't ever quite establish himself as like a first team player at Liverpool. I think he only played sort of seven, maybe 10 games for the first team. One of which was a win over Manchester United, where apparently Mark George Best out of the game, which is no small achievement. But he was never, ever able to, I think, dislodge. I think it was like Alec Lindsay was the left back at the time, who was never able to dislodge him. I think when he was about 28, he was asked to move on to the coaching staff. And there's a famous quote that the former Liverpool chairman, Sir John Smith, made where he described Roy Evans' appointment as like an appointment for tomorrow, and Evans would be a future manager of Liverpool, which obviously proved to be quite prophetic. And like I say, he obviously had been around the backroom team for, since his retirement as a player. And he'd first of all worked, I think, as the reserve team manager. Then he'd graduated to like sort of first team coach, served as physio, like I was saying. And then ultimately he was like assistant manager to Souness when I think sort of some of the pressure was beginning to tell on Souness. And I think therefore it was like sort of no real surprise that he was named as the successor, because I think, like I said before, there was a desire both from the fan base and from the leadership within the club, like David Moores and what have you, to reconnect with the boot room, which Souness was sort of seen to kind of maybe move away from, rightly or wrongly.
So in the immediate, was he a popular choice by the Liverpool faithful?
I think with the fans, yeah, I think because he was like a lifelong Liverpudlian, wasn't he? He was like sort of somebody who'd been involved as far back as Shankly, so he understood the club. I think he obviously also understood the task and perhaps the magnitude of the task that lay ahead, because obviously the period we're sort of describing, football in England was changing. It was the birth of the Premier League, a whole new ball game, as the Sky advert went, and all of that. So the money was kind of coming into the game much more. Liverpool, I think, as a club, probably were a bit slow to react to the increased commercial opportunities that were available. Manchester United, who obviously like usurped Liverpool during this era, they famously had like sort of I think a massive like superstore at Old Trafford, where Liverpool was still operating a little bit of a tin pot club shop at the time. They obviously then made moves to kind of put that right, but I think we were always like a few steps behind during this period. Whereas Souness, I think, had been probably guilty of looking to the future too soon in terms of some of his training methods, which were seen as revolutionary at the time. They became pretty normal quite quickly. Evans and the appointment of Evans was probably Liverpool harking back to what had gone before. I suppose in hindsight, it maybe wasn't the appointment that the club needed, but I think at the time, everybody would have been very receptive to the idea of Roy Evans becoming the manager. People would have been very excited because, as I say, he was sort of seen as a traditionalist who'd reconnect the club with what had gone before. And also, like, as we'll come on to talk about, I think in absolute fairness to Roy Evans, like, his sides played some very, very attractive football. They were perhaps unlucky not to win more trophies than they did, but we'll come on to talk about that.
Do you know if he was seen as a caretaker manager initially, and at what point was he regarded as a permanent manager?
When Roy Evans was appointed, I would have only been about like 10 or 11 years of age, maybe 10. I can remember reading, and I think it was like one of the magazines, like Shoot or Match, that, used to be released on a weekly basis. And it was a column that I think someone like Jimmy Graves wrote for either Shoot or Match. And they were very much talking about Roy Evans in terms of as a caretaker manager. I think in that particular article, Kevin Keegan and Terry McDermott were mentioned as potential future managers and assistant managers. But I don't really remember it being seen as in being a caretaker. He was never named formally as a caretaker manager. So I think the impression people might have had was that he was going to be something of a caretaker. But I think, by the sort of the end of the 93-94 season into the 94-95, he'd spent quite a bit of money. I think there was two big high profile signings we made at the start of the 94-95 season, Phil Babb and John Scales. So, and Liverpool started that particular season well. They were playing with a kind of a newly found verve. And yeah, so I think by that point, any notions of him being a caretaker were sort of put to bed. But I can remember vaguely reading something to that effect when he was initially appointed.
Upon him taking charge in January 94, what was the backbone of the team left at his disposal?
It was kind of a bit of a mishmash, really, because soon as the one thing I think you could probably say that was a positive about Graham Souness's tenure was the fact that he brought through like a nucleus of talented young players. So the likes of Rob Jones, Steve McManaman, Jamie Redknapp, and then latterly Robbie Fowler. These were all good young players. So Evans had a nucleus of a side there, I guess, to sort of work around. There were a number of other young players who were on maybe like the fringes of things under Souness. So Don Hutchison, Steve Hartness, Mike Marsh had all kind of had an impact to a limited degree. So they were the young players that were there. But then there was also like an old guard of players who'd been, I suppose, the backbone of Liverpool's last like great side under Dalglish. So the likes of Barnes, Grobbelaar, Molby, Nicol, Rush, and Whelan were all still there. So I suppose it was a bit of a hodgepodge, really, because it was kind of you had these players who had a history and a pedigree of winning things, and then this new crop of young players who were all very talented, but perhaps needed guidance. And I guess that's where Souness didn't succeed really, because he brought through all of these young players, but didn't maybe refine them in alignment with the players that had gone before. And so around this time, Liverpool were like on the day they could still play impressive football and put sides to the sword, but they were quite weak defensively. I can remember a lot of games where they'd get like smashed, like 5-1, 5-2. Like they seemed to lack a bit of game management, really. It wasn't a great side that he inherited by any stretch of the imagination.
David James had been signed by Souness as an
Yeah,
heir apparent to Bruce Grobbelaar. You had the
yeah.
Norwegian Stig Inge Bjørneby, the tough defender Julian Dix, who had come from West Ham, the Danish defender Torben Pieknik. Neil Ruddock had left Tottenham in the summer of '93. You also had Nigel Clough, who had come from the relegated Nottingham Forest. Like you said, many of the defenders, like the likes of Julian Dix and Pieknik, never really settled at Liverpool. Now,
No, no. I mean, Julian Dix was a strange one in terms of his career at Liverpool, really. He didn't really stay for very long. I think we talked last time we spoke, didn't we, about Souness, and we were talking more about like the early part of his regime. But certainly some of the names you've sort of reeled off there, they're kind of the negative legacy of Souness, signing sometimes that were made for reasonably big money that just didn't work out. I mean, some of them players had reasonable careers with Liverpool, but the likes of Nigel Clough, like he started really, really well. I remember like people being very impressed by him. But then by the end of that season, he was playing more in a central midfield role rather than where he'd been brought in to play. And it probably didn't suit him or the team. Yeah, Julian Dix, like, I just don't ever think he was a Liverpool type of player. And that deal was a bizarre one because we exchanged, I think, Mike Marsh and
David
David
Burrows, yeah.
Burrows. Yeah,
Yeah.
and both of them were probably better players than Julian Dix, I'd say. It sort of smacks of like maybe some of the desperation Souness was feeling at this time. I think the reason he brought in the likes of Dix and Rudder, we were, as I say, we were a bit soft-centered and they were obviously like robust players, shall we say. Maybe we lost a little bit in terms of quality with those signings.
How did Roy Evans see out the last few months of the 1993-94 season, which was the last one before the demolition of the Cope?
Yeah, I mean, when I was looking back over the season review, there wasn't an immediate impact by any stretch of the imagination. So his record in the remaining games, I wrote it down as like played 16, won 5, drew 2, lost 9. So it wasn't like an immediate kind of uplift. And some of the defeats that we suffered were pretty chasing in. Like we got hammered by Southampton in a televised game. I suppose also a few home defeats that were poor, like the likes of like Sheffield United and Newcastle, and then
And Norwich for
most
the last
notably, yeah,
match of the
Norwich,
Cup,
which was
yeah.
the last game in front of the Kop, and
Yeah.
I can remember that day vividly. Going and everybody being really positive before the game, a lot of the former greats of Liverpool were sort of introduced to the crowd, the likes of Dalglish, Phil Thompson, Tommy Smith, etc. Joe Fagan came out with the widows of Bill and Bob Paisley. So there was a really positive atmosphere, even though the team wasn't great at that time. Everyone was in the mood for the celebration. Then we got beat by Norwich. Jeremy Goss scored a worldie, I think I remember at the time. We weren't in great shape at that time. I mean, there were a few positive performances. I remember we got beat twice by Arsenal and Manchester United in away games, but we played really well in both of them. Some of those young players who I mentioned before were sort of integral in those games, beginning to show their quality. But yeah, there wasn't an immediate impact. I think if we didn't know already when Evans took over how big the job was, that remaining part of that season showed to everyone really how far Liverpool had fallen and how big a job it was going to be to try and resurrect the club.
Liverpool finished in the eighth position. In the 42 matches, they won 17, they lost 16.
They started that season quite well as well. I think they'd won the first four of the first five
Right.
games or something, and that seemed to be a pattern under Souness. They'd started the season quite well, and then when things maybe began to go a little bit wrong, they didn't have any resolve. But yeah, it wasn't a great season. I think it was like Liverpool's lowest finish since the first season that they'd come back into the first division. Yeah, not a great season.
Let's look at Roy Evans's first full season in charge, the 1994-95 season. As far as transfers, it looks like Roy Evans starts to clear out some of the players, like Ronnie Whelan, the Danish defender Torben Pieknik, Bruce Grublar. They're all offloaded, followed by Don Hutchison, who joins West Ham. And
Yeah.
also later in the first months of the season, Paul Stewart is offloaded to Wolves and Julian Dix returns to West Ham. As far as the players coming in, there were no transfers in the summer, but then just within days of one another in September, he makes, like you mentioned earlier, very key signings in defense. The Irish international Phil Babb comes from Coventry, and John Scales comes from Wimbledon, and to solidify the Liverpool defense. And later in the second half of the season, we have the Irish midfielder Mark Kennedy coming in, but he never really made an impact in his Liverpool career. Obviously, there was somewhat of an improvement in Liverpool's fortunes, and they would finish fourth. The highlight was winning the League Cup against Bolton.
The big thing that he did was move out a lot of aging players, really. So the likes of Grobbelaar, Ronnie Whelan, I think Steve Nicol moved on not long after as well. So that was kind of like dispensing with some of the old guard. Obviously, I think you mentioned before, David James was now established as like the number one goalkeeper. When we brought Babb and Scales in, Liverpool then made a decision to play with three central defenders, which it doesn't sound it, but back then it was quite revolutionary to have three centre halves playing in an era where most sides were playing firmly 4-4-2. That season, we did begin to sort of pick up and play some really good stuff. McManaman, I think I remember, really came back to the fore this season after losing his way a little bit under Souness. He was given something of like a free role and encouraged, obviously, to run at opposition defences, which he did really well. He linked up very well with Robbie Fowler, who had broken through latterly under Souness, but was a very, very exciting player, described in many quarters around this time as like the best natural finisher since Jimmy Greaves. As a whole, the season, we never really looked like making a sustained league championship challenge, but as you say, we won the League Cup, which is one of the sort of major prizes in the game, particularly back then as well. We did that quite impressively. We beat Blackburn, who went on to win the league away from home in one of the ties in that run. Beat Arsenal, who were obviously still a good side. Crystal Palace in the semi-final, and then, as you say, Bolton in the final. I think that was a big thing to get a trophy on the board in his first season.
We should add that against Arsenal, Robbie Fowler scored the fastest hat trick in Premier
Yeah,
League.
in the opening weeks of the season, yeah, that was an impressive win, an impressive sort of record which stood for quite a long time. We also had quite a good run in the FA Cup as well. I remember there was like a defeat we suffered to Tottenham, but it was quite an epic end-to-end game, really entertaining match. I think Tottenham, when they beat Liverpool, they drew Everton in the semi-final, and Everton weren't a vintage Everton, shall we say. So the expectations were, I think, that Tottenham were going to beat them and play Man United in the final, but Joe Royle's Dogs of War put them to the sword, and Everton ended up winning the FA Cup. So both Merseyside teams ended that season with a trophy. But yeah, there was definite progress that season from the dark days of the Souness era. Definite progress.
There was a feeling that Liverpool were getting back to their best with an exciting young squad, and Fowler, McManaman, and Redknapp were seen as future internationals. Do you think that after this good season, there was a feeling that the Souness era may have been an anomaly and Liverpool were back to where they once were, or were people still cautious about the future?
A bit of both, I think. I mean, you've got to remember, I think that at this point, it's only sort of 5 years since Liverpool had been league champions, which seems strange, really, when you think the wait they would have would end up being 30 years to get that monkey off their backs. But I can remember feeling as a fan at that time that 5 years seemed like a lifetime since they'd won the league. And as you say, there was this like really positive, exciting new young side. And also, Man United had obviously been beginning to be a dominant force at this time. But that summer, Ferguson famously made the decision to sell, I think it was Ince, Hughes and Kanchelskis, and they'd been mainstays of the first great United side under Ferguson. So it was around the time Alan Hansen made that famous quote, you can't win anything with kids. So I think a lot of people would have thought that there was an opportunity here because United were perhaps in transition. As you say, people were maybe beginning to feel like Liverpool were starting to get it back together again. So, yeah, I think there would have been optimism ahead of the following season, particularly when we broke the transfer record to bring Collymore in. That would have been seen as a big feather in the cap, I think.
We come to the 1995-96 season, and Liverpool are back in Europe playing in the UEFA Cup. As you mentioned, there was a record transfer of Stan Collymore after an excellent season with Nottingham Forest, and he was very much in demand this summer. Just a few months later, Irish international Jason McAteer also arrives from Bolton. Steve Nicol is offloaded. He goes to Notts County. Later, Jan Molby is also offloaded to Barnsley. And eventually, into the new year, Nigel Clough joins Manchester City. Not many transfers, but obviously, the arrival of Stan Collymore was seen as a statement of purpose from Liverpool. As far as the season in Europe, they reached the second round where they lose to Danish side Brøndby. In the league, they're just behind Manchester United and Newcastle. And it's fair to say, if not for Black November, probably Liverpool would have had a shot at the title. And Black November is because I think in November, what is it? They lost 3 matches and tied one or something like that.
Yeah, I remember it being described as like a nightmare November. That was the term I think I can remember being used at the time. But yeah, that was where the season was undone, really, where we lost 2-1 to Newcastle, who were flying high at the top of the league at that point. But Liverpool had been much the better side in that game, and we lost the last minute goal. I think it was a bit of a fumble from David James. So patterns are starting to emerge here, Shahan, that will probably repeat as we go on. Yeah, then we lost to Everton. We were inspired by Andre Kanchelskis. And then another defeat in the Northeast, Middlesbrough, which again was another game where we'd played probably the better football, but had shown sort of a bit of a soft underbelly, really, which was really disappointing because we'd started the campaign reasonably well.
Otherwise,
We,
that month, the entire season, they were very good. Uh,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah, they went on a massive unbeaten run after November where they were really playing with a swashbuckling kind of style, like really putting teams to the sword. There's a game I can remember where we played Aston Villa and it was a televised game on a Sunday and we were like 3-0 up within 10 minutes. And, they were like a challenging side as well. They weren't like a poor outfit, but we were really playing with a great degree of verve and style and passing the ball very well. We beat Manchester United at home in I think it was the December. We beat them 2-0, but it could have been 5 or 6, really. Peter Schmeichel had an outstanding game, I remember, for United, despite being, according to Andy Gray, at fault for the first goal. But we really had quite a number of wins that were hugely impressive. We were sort of on this long unbeaten run. As I say, Villa, that was a game where I think everyone started to get quite excited and thought, oh, we're back in the title picture here. And Newcastle were beginning to fade, really. Liverpool and obviously United were kind of hunting them down. And the difference, I think, between, say, ourselves and Manchester United, they were like sort of scrapping 1-0 wins repeatedly, time after time, often inspired by Cantona and like the solid sort of defence they had with Schmeichel in goal. And Liverpool were like battering teams, and it looked as though we were building up a head of steam and momentum. But then, as was often the case under Roy Evans, we just often used to throw in a poor performance in a game we'd be expected to win. So in this case, Nottingham Forest, I think, beat us, and that derailed this long run we'd been on. We then had to play Newcastle next at home, which was probably for ourselves like the last chance saloon to sort of stay in the title picture. But it was obviously a key game for them as well because they'd been well ahead in January and had faded a little bit. So it set it up for this game that became recognised in history as the greatest game in Premier League history, TM. I think we're going to come on to talk about that game now, aren't we?
Incidentally, this 4-3 scoreline was repeated in the following season, but the sequence of the goals were different. This match has been referenced as one of the greatest matches in the history of the game, in fact.
Yeah.
However, if you ask Brian Glanville, he would say there were so many defensive errors that it shouldn't be regarded as such, but nevertheless, it still lives in memory. How is this particular 4-3 win, followed by the one the following year? How are these matches regarded decades later?
The first one certainly was a remarkable game, end to end, kind of back and forth, nip and tuck in terms of who was in the lead and what have you. I think it was very much what Sky were wanting when they sort of marketed the Premier League as a whole new ball game. But as you say, it had everything apart from perhaps like competent goalkeeping and defending, which is probably what Brian Glanville's referring to. It was a fantastic game that ebbed and flowed, as I say, and there was a lot of emotional tension in the ground. I think that came across in the televised nature of it as well. Obviously, Liverpool won in the end 4-3. Famous sort of commentary, Collymore closing in. He lashes it home and we're 4-3 ahead. Keegan's head sinks and Liverpool are bouncing. I think it's quite fitting as well that obviously it's almost like the end of one era, that particular game, because Ian Rush comes on and has a hand in like laying on the goal. And he'd been sort of marginalised a little bit throughout the course of this campaign as Collymore and Fowler had begun to, become a fantastic partnership. But I think it's fitting that he comes on and sort of has a part to play in what is one of the greatest games in Premier League history. But then we'd had this massive high of winning this game and everybody sort of feeling, well, we've really kind of pulled ourselves back into this again now. But then in the next match, we went and got beat by Coventry. And that pretty much sums up Liverpool under Roy Evans, really. Like, capable of brilliance one moment, but lacking maybe the stomach for the fight and kind of not able to do it consistently over the course of a season. The second 4-3, that also kind of sums up Liverpool under Evans in another way, that shouldn't have been 4-3, that game. It shouldn't have been as much of a tense affair as it was, because we were very, very comfortable in that game.
Yeah, we
And
should
then,
remind everyone that Liverpool had taken a 3-0 lead and it looked like the match was
yeah,
over, but then Newcastle tied the match 3-3, and then
yeah,
just Liverpool just at the end edged ahead with an extra goal.
yeah, yeah. So it wasn't the epic sort of ebb and flow kind of contest that the previous one was. David James had one of his erratic performances and Newcastle fought back into the game, but we did get a late winner. I think it was Fowler in that game, but it should have been a comfortable win, really, the second one. It was more just that we didn't have game management again, I think would be the phrase I'd use. But the first one, fantastic game, had everything apart from perhaps defensive solidity, but it was kind of very much recognised as a great game. But also, unwittingly, we put a massive damage to Newcastle's title aspirations by beating them in that game. I think ultimately it was United who prevailed that season through just churning out these solid, narrow wins, whereas like Liverpool and Newcastle were perhaps more entertaining sides, but didn't have that solidity. That's what wins you championships, isn't it? At the end of the day.
And that season, Liverpool would reach the final of the FA Cup, but they would lose to Manchester United through an Eric Cantona strike.
Yeah.
In retrospect, do you think the whole banter and criticism regarding the issue with the white suits and the whole being nicknamed Spice Boys,
Mm.
etc., do you think that went kind of over the top? And I mean, had they won, perhaps no one would have even mentioned the white suits.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it was naive to wear the white suits, really, because it speaks to that idea that they were playboys and that they were concentrating on things other than the football. But I don't remember it being actually that big a deal on the day itself in the build
Or
up.
subsequently it has become, I think,
Yeah,
right?
like,
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's sort of one of those things that's grown over time. And I saw an interview a few years ago that Fergie did with I think it was Nick Robinson off the BBC. And Ferguson obviously likes to paint it that he saw us in those suits and the likes of David James, Jamie Redknapp in designer sunglasses and what have you. And he sends to Brian Kidd and says 1-0, we'll beat them. Big psychological blow has been delivered. I think it's easy to sort of say that with hindsight, isn't it? Now, thinking back to the day itself and in the lead into it, we'd had the better of Manchester United twice that season. So there was the game that I mentioned before where we won 2-0 at Anfield, but the game at Old Trafford had been a 2-2 draw when Eric Cantona had returned from his suspension, and Liverpool had played really well in that game and probably should have won it. So in the two matches that season, we've been better, I think, than Man United. So there was no reason why we shouldn't have been confident going into that game. But then that actual game itself was such a dire game from both sides, really. United played a very containing, sort of conservative game in which they look to sort of negate the influence of McManaman, and they succeeded, really. Then obviously a fantastic goal from Cantona. However, and I'm going to sound like a little bit bitter here, but Phil Babb should never put that out for a corner. I don't understand what's going through his head at that point. David James shouldn't come for that cross. And fair play to Cantona, it's an amazing strike, but it goes through about 4 or 5 players. Suddenly, that narrative is then able to shift, isn't it? United have then won a double-double. Liverpool are portrayed as Spice Boys, bottlers, chokers, whatever you want to say. For me, it sort of goes to show like the fine margins really at the very top in football and how hindsight bias is like a massive thing. Because like if you flip it and talk about the previous decade in the 80s, Manchester United were like the nearly men. There was obviously a lot of talk again after the fact that there was a big drinking culture at United. Whereas if you read Simon Hughes's books with like the player interviews, there was as big a drinking culture, if not bigger, at Liverpool. They just won things. Whereas in this particular time, it was United who were getting over the line and winning things. So I think, yeah, the suits thing has been overplayed, hasn't it? Subsequently, but it probably was a bit of a daft thing to do as well. Do that after you've won, not before you've won, is how I'd probably talk about it.
Well, in any case, it was an end of an era because Ian Rush would leave at the end of the season and he joined Leeds. This was the second time he had left Liverpool. So all in all, I think he was at Liverpool maybe 15, 16 years,
Yeah,
except that one season at Juventus.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, it was a massive wrench because Ian Rush was my hero when I was a kid. I actually went to the Ian Rush soccer school during the summer holidays when I was little, an aspiring goalkeeper, and I saved the penalty from Ian Rush. Don't think he meant to score, obviously, but like that was a moment that I remember being like in awe around him. He'd been in the team all my life, really. It definitely felt strange him leaving. I think it was probably the right time, particularly with Collymore coming in and the partnership with Fowler and Michael Owen there. He was obviously beginning to emerge in the background around this time as well. Rush got a very, very emotional send off in his last game against Middlesbrough. And yeah, he went to Leeds, but I don't think that really worked out, did it? I think he was sort of past his best by this point. But absolute fantastic servant for Liverpool. Probably the greatest goal scorer we've ever had, which, given the company you're talking about there, speaks volumes for his qualities, really.
Now we come to the 1996-97 season. Just to point out that we will be discussing this season separately by itself as well to discuss the European adventure in full. But let's discuss this season. It was the first season post the 1996 Euros hosted in England. And it was the first season of the new Bosman ruling, where European community players were not considered as foreign players. And also, there's this adventure in Europe in a Cup Winners' Cup that we will discuss. As far as the departures, we mentioned Ian Rush, who joined Leeds. A few months into the season, John Scales also leaves to join Tottenham. As far as the arrivals, we have the Czech midfielder Patrick Berger, who had stood out in the Euros. He comes from Borussia Dortmund. Later in the season, you have the Danish goalkeeper Jørgen Nilsson coming in as a backup, as
Mm,
well as Norwegian defender Bjorn Kvarm from
mm.
Rosenborg, although neither of these two really make an impact. So again, the transfer activity was light, which is surprising because it seemed like after the Bozeman ruling, it seemed like everyone
Yeah.
was making a multitude of signings.
I
Yeah.
think like this season, as you say, we'll come on to talk about it in more depth in another episode. This was sort of where it begins to turn, I think, for Roy Evans, because this season, the 96-97 season, was a missed opportunity, really. We had a settled side. As you say, we'd added Berger, who had been fantastic in the Euros, was a dynamic talent, and definitely added something. But really, I think we should have been looking more widely at sort of like reinforcements at the other end of the pitch. And as you say, the opportunities that were available in the Bosman market, I think Liverpool were a bit slow to react to all of that again. More broadly, it was a hugely sort of exciting time in terms of football, sort of following on from Euro 96 and the emergence really of like foreign players en masse into the Premier League. It would have been, and again, an exciting season in prospect for Liverpool because we were back in Europe in a competition, like almost by default because we didn't win the FA Cup, but we were in the Cup Winners' Cup. And this was a tournament that Liverpool had never won. So that would have been particularly attractive ahead of that season. And yeah, there would have been optimism again ahead of that campaign. But I think looking back, we probably could have been a little bit more active in the transfer market.
Liverpool will reach the semi-finals of this Cup Winners' Cup, being eliminated by Paris Saint-Germain. As far as the league title, they were very much in it, but except right at the end when they finished fourth.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was a strange season, really, because for most of it, we were consistent and we looked pretty solid, and we were leading at the halfway point, which is always a reasonably good marker. I can remember where it sort of started to turn for me. I think there was a defeat that we had in the FA Cup to Chelsea where we'd been like 2-0 up and we ended up losing 4-2. Again, as I've sort of mentioned before, it was an example of where we failed under Roy Evans because we sort of just got outfought and lacked a bit of a stomach for a fight and caved in, and Chelsea just battered us in the second half, won 4-2. So that was in a bit of an alarm bells moment, really. And then the league campaign sort of unfurled all quite quickly, really. So there was a horrible few days I can remember in the April where we lost at home to Coventry in a game that we'd have been expected to win. You know, Coventry were a side struggling with the prospect of relegation. Dion Dublin, I think, scored twice on that day. We just threw it away, really. And then Paris Saint-Germain away, I can remember we just got absolutely obliterated 3-0. Suddenly, a season that promised a lot was gone, really, or almost gone. And then there was a lot of pressure on us ahead of like what was probably like going to be seen as like a title decider with Manchester United. And we lost 3-1 at Anfield. Again, David James just like it probably hurts me to talk about these games to be honest, but like he just had
Yeah, he had many mistakes during the
yeah,
season, not
yeah.
just this match. And
No, but that was one where we'd fought back to be 1-1 in a game that was obviously of crucial importance. He just made some howlers.
speaking of David
Pressure.
James, was it this season or the following season where he said the reason why he was making so many mistakes was that he was spending too much time playing video games?
Yeah, I think it was this season. Yeah, I think it was this season that he said that. This is sort of where Roy Evans' legacy is a little bit tarnished, I suppose, because I think he showed a degree of ruthlessness, like in his early part of his reign, where he moved on a lot of big names who were older quite quickly and got them out of the door quite ruthlessly. David James, Ruddock, these are players who I think he showed too much loyalty to. And he probably should have dispensed with them a little bit earlier because they continued to have ups and downs. And as time wore on, this became more of a problem for Liverpool and more of a problem for Evans, really. But yeah, the thing about that game against United, they didn't even really play well to beat us in that game. That was the thing that hurt the most. They won 3-1 without really kind of having to break a sweat too much. And Liverpool helped them to win that game and to win the title. And the whole thing of finishing fourth in a two-horse race, that was where probably certainly questions about Roy Evans and whether he was going to be the man to restore Liverpool to the former position in the game really began to come to the fore, I think, after this season.
Stan Collymore also did not settle at
Yeah.
Liverpool and would leave at the end of this season. How is his impact regarded? Because like first season, it looked like towards the end he was really settling in and having a fine partnership with Robbie Fowler. But it seems like for the second season, he did not have the same impact.
I think it was always with Collymore, there was always off the field issues, wasn't there? It wasn't necessarily about his performances on the field, which by and large were good. I think the second season he was in and out of the team a bit more. I think he never really settled at Liverpool. I don't think he moved to the area, so he was always late for training. And I think by the end of that season, Roy Evans had sort of just ran out of patience with him, really, despite the fact that he played so well with Robbie Fowler, which is interesting because they didn't actually get on that well, Fowler and Collymore, but as a partnership, they were fantastic. So yeah, it was a shame because he had so much ability, Stan Collymore. It was just, I think, there was always issues off the field throughout his career, not just at Liverpool, really.
We come to the 1997-98 season. As far as transfers, we mentioned Collymore leaves, John Barnes leaves after a decade, joins Newcastle. As far as the players coming in, we have a Norwegian midfielder, Øyvind Leonardsen, coming from Wimbledon. Paul Ince returns to England from Italian side Inter. Karl-Heinz Riedle, the German striker, arrives from Dortmund. Later in the season, we have American goalkeeper Brad Friedel coming from Columbus Crew, but I think he would have work permit problems, or was it the following season? I don't remember.
He had work permit problems. I mean, Brad Friedel, I think Liverpool wanted to sign him as far back as when Graham Souness had been the manager. So I think he'd been on the radar of the club for quite a while. And I think what was the issue, him signing previously, and I think at this time as well, there were work permit issues. But yeah, he was a good goalkeeper. Perhaps Liverpool didn't see the very best of him. He kind of went on to have a stellar career in England after he left Liverpool, really. Yeah, I can remember him coming in and taking David James's place for a little while. Like it was then a kind of bit of a back and forth between the two as to who was the goalkeeper. In terms of the transfer activity, Paul Ince was the big one, wasn't it? Because in the 90s, like particularly the late, when Evans was the manager, I can remember if Liverpool had lost, and obviously they did suffer some embarrassing defeats, as we've mentioned. You'd always hear on like local radio phone-ins, people phoning up saying that basically what Liverpool needs is a Paul Ince type midfielder. That's what we're lacking. So what better thing to do than buy Paul Ince himself? Now, in hindsight, this didn't really work, I don't think, because what had been so good about the Evans side, they were a footballing side. They kind of played the ball out from the back. They were all comfortable on the ball, etc. And we played with this 3-5-2. And suddenly, when we brought Paul Ince in, whether it was he couldn't play in that role or it wasn't getting the best out of him or the team as a whole, but suddenly we moved from this 3-5-2 to playing more of a standard 4-4-2. I personally think it was due to like Ince's limitations as a player because we'd had John Barnes in that role, who, albeit wasn't as maybe combative as Paul Ince, he was much better on the ball and started the attacks with. So yeah, the Ince signing, I just don't think it worked out really. It set us back more than taking us forward. Riedler was a good player. I think we probably got him towards the end of his career, and it would
Yes,
it
yes.
would have been good if we'd have got him a few seasons earlier because he definitely had all the attributes to be a top player in the English game, and he's well thought of, I think, by Liverpool fans generally because he combined not only with Fowler but with Michael Owen as he came through. So that was a big plus point of the 97-98 campaign, the emergence of Owen. And because Fowler had got injured and we suddenly had Riedler playing with Owen. I think Riedler played a little bit of like the rush kind of role to Fowler, kind of the old heads who sort of guided this young player through and helped him to come on and do all the great things that he did. Leonardson, he'd done really well from, I think at the time, he'd been like statistically like a good player for Wimbledon, and therefore it was seen as like a good signing on paper. I think he was kind of just one of these players who the step up to play for a big side like Liverpool was perhaps too great. And I don't think he was ever able to reproduce the form that he had shown for Wimbledon. So yeah, suddenly I think this season it's not where it all went wrong. We're not moving forward by this point because Arsenal, I think, won the league this year, didn't they?
Yes.
97,
Yes.
98, yeah. So suddenly we're now behind, I think, Arsenal, United,
Yes.
Chelsea.
Yeah, Liverpool finished third, so they're a high finishing side, but they just don't have that little bit of extra to maybe
Yeah,
tilt for the title.
yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
I think that's the thing that like the Paul Ince signing was supposed to be this kind of final piece in the jigsaw, as it were, but it didn't work in terms of it meant that we played a different style. Something was lost, in my opinion, through moving away from the 3-5-2 because that had been our trademark, if you like, with the marauding wing backs, and we didn't have that anymore. We maybe were I don't know, maybe we were more solid, but we certainly weren't as entertaining that season as we had been in the previous years. And I don't think we felt as fans that we were getting closer really by this point. And it seemed like we were going further away.
Yeah, so the story was the emergence of Michael Owen. Of course, we remember what he would do at the World Cup.
Yeah.
And in the summer of 1998, the decision was made to hire the Frenchman Gérard Houllier effectively as the next manager. For the time being, it was decided to have a co-managership with Roy Evans. How was this decision viewed at the time? Because it did not look like it was going to be a tenable situation.
It's funny, isn't it, looking back on these things many years later, because it's just an unfathomable concept, isn't it? The idea of this joint managers. And I think I can remember like my dad being incredulous at the time, just like this is a farce. I think the club tried to put a positive spin on it, didn't they? And like there was the press conferences where they made all the right noises, but I don't think it was ever going to work. Ultimately, because you've got two very different men with very different backgrounds and very different philosophies on football. Houllier, I think he played a more pragmatic game than Roy Evans. He obviously came into the club with a belief that he needed to instill discipline and probably felt that maybe Roy had been too loyal to certain players.
Do you know how they were managing? Like, how did that work out?
Yeah, I mean, there's different stories, isn't there, that you read in certain players' autobiographies. Certain players have obviously been involved in podcasts. I think Jason McAteer, I can remember him speaking on, I think it's the Under the Kosh podcast about this time and how there were certain players who were perhaps like Evans loyalists, as it were, made life maybe difficult for Houllier. I think the idea was that they would do everything collaboratively. Well, that's never going to work, is it? There's always got to be a fall guy, and ultimately that I think was going to be Roy Evans in this particular situation. You know, they started off quite well. Like the results in the opening weeks of the season were quite positive. I can remember reading in Robbie Fowler's autobiography that where it began to unfurl, there was a game against Valencia, I think, in the UEFA Cup, where Houllier was apparently getting shirts ready to swap with officials. And Roy Evans was furious because he felt these officials had almost put us out of the tournament. So these cracks began to emerge. Ultimately, it was after a disappointing League Cup exit to Spurs when Roy Evans was basically let go, wasn't he? I think he was sort of resigned or whatever, but he was kind of the victim of the sluggish start. And that was the end of his time, really, with Liverpool.
Do you think he was not sacked in the summer of 98 because the higher ups may have been afraid of the fan reaction given his history with the club?
Possibly. I also think naively that they did genuinely think that this joint managership would work. And I think, again, as I'm sort of recalling now, I think Roy Evans and Peter Robinson and Rick Parry had conversations apparently, and there was like Roy Evans believed that Houllier was coming in as an assistant, as part of a coaching staff overhaul, whereas obviously he wasn't. He was being brought in really to kind of maybe shepherd Roy out of the way. I don't think it was handled very well. I think ultimately, like, even in the course of the conversation, you can sort of see, like, I was sort of saying myself that it probably was time for Roy Evans to depart and it could have been handled better. They had this almost uneasy compromise, which didn't help anyone and probably set the club back further again, because by the time Roy did leave that season, again, you're then in a position where you're asking Houllier to reshape the team mid-season, which is always very, very difficult. And so that campaign, the 98-99, it wasn't a good one for Liverpool. Whereas if they had made the call to dispense with Evans' services, Houllier certainly went about kind of reshaping the squad pretty ruthlessly the following summer. So maybe doing that a year earlier wouldn't have been a problem. But yeah, I think they just didn't handle it very well. And I think probably what they didn't want to do was tarnish what had been a remarkable relationship, really, with Roy Evans. You know, the fact that he'd worked his way up from being a youth player to manager. It was never going to be easy to get rid of someone who'd been at the club so long. But yeah, they just didn't handle it very well, like many things in the 90s.
In his last acts, I guess he offloaded Neil Ruddock, Michael Thomas, among others. And as far as signings, he brought in Norwegian defender Vegard Hegem from
Mm.
Rosenborg. German striker Sean Dundee was signed, as was Steve Staunton. He returned from Aston Villa. After Jean Rouillet was appointed as sole manager, he started bringing in players. He brought the French midfielder Jean-Michel Ferry, the Cameroon defender Rigobert Song in January, along with Norwegian defender Frode Kipp, and later Jimmy Traore from Mali. You can see he's starting to bring in his own players once he's given full charge. As far as the season, Liverpool just squeaked by and just finished seventh position. They could never really make up the deficit. Roy Evans' era was finished. Let's look at his tenure on balance. How were his years as Liverpool manager regarded? Was he seen as the man who may have temporarily revived the club?
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it, to like look at it on balance because the return of one League Cup during his tenure isn't that impressive. However, I think that side between sort of 94, 95 and 96, 97 could and should have won more. I think his tenure kind of illustrates really some of the fine margins at the top level in football. I also think he was a bit unfortunate in the sense that he had a massive job to do in terms of undoing some of the damage that had been done by Souness. Also, alongside that, trying to sort of stop the emerging juggernaut that was Manchester United in the 90s. So yeah, I think he'll sort of be seen as something of a nearly man, won't he, Roy Evans? It's like he did a good job in terms of getting Liverpool playing attractive football again and getting the side to a point where they were capable of challenging for trophies, but they perhaps lacked a little bit of nous in terms of how to get over the line in the overarching sort of 38 game season. But there were a lot of positives, like I say, the way we played, particularly in 95, 96, and into the following season, some fantastic football. And yeah, I think he was just slightly unfortunate, really. Like maybe the board could have backed him a little bit more with transfers at certain key points because he was certainly interested in players. Like I remember Yari Littmanen when he eventually signed for Liverpool, saying that he almost signed around this time in sort of like 1997. And it's like, you think if you'd have added a player like that at that time, maybe that would have been the actual final piece of the jigsaw. But yeah, I think we were too soft defensively, really. That was kind of the thing. And we didn't have a reliable goalkeeper. Whereas, like, if you look at United at that time, we were obviously the dominant force. They had a solid defence and probably the best goalkeeper in the world at that time. And that enabled them, particularly in 95, 96, to get over the line through grinding out win after win, which is something we just didn't manage under Roy Evans, unfortunately.
Despite not making their debuts under him, it seemed like we got to see the best of the likes of Fowler, McManaman, and Redknapp under
Yeah.
Roy Evans. Was that the general feeling?
Yeah, I mean, they probably each played the best football of their career, Liverpool careers under Roy Evans. I think Redknapp and Barnes would have benefited if, say, if Steven Gerrard was a few years older and he'd kind of come into the first team picture that at that time because we lacked legs in the midfield. I think, somebody who could provide drive and industry. Redknapp was a nice footballer, but he didn't perhaps have the engine that maybe someone like Gerrard had, certainly. Barnes was by that point kind of like a fading force, really. But yeah, Fowler, McManaman were fantastic in this era. Yeah, they were sort of the shining lights, really, of Roy Evans' tenure.
Do you think Roy Evans was also the victim of the overspending of the Bozeman era, as the likes of Chelsea, Arsenal, Manchester United, they all spent more in the transfer market?
Mm,
As we saw, as we were going through the seasons, there were like maybe one or two key transfers per season, but not more
mm.
than that.
He probably showed too much loyalty to the goalkeeper and a couple of the defenders, particularly like Ruddock. Bab was a big buy, but I don't ever think he ever really lived up to the billing of that fee. So yeah, probably if he'd have kind of had a little bit more ruthlessness in terms of bringing in a new goalkeeper and maybe a more mobile kind of defender, I don't think we were far off under Roy Evans. And when you sort of review it holistically, like we have done, yeah, there was probably a few transfer windows, although I don't think we called them transfer windows back then, where we could have perhaps been more active. And in the book, Simon wrote Men in White Suits. The chapter with Roy Evans is really interesting because he talks about how they were interested in signing Andy Cole, Yari Littman, and obviously they got Collymore. The issues for me were always at the other end of the pitch, and we should have probably focused on getting a resolute centre half and a more consistent goalkeeper. So that would be where I would sort of highlight if he was to kind of go back and do it all again, maybe looking in those areas.
I remember reading an article by Brian Glanville in World Soccer where he was trying to illustrate that Roy Evans was too much of a nice guy and did not have enough authority on his players in a
Mm,
manner of a Shankly or Fergie.
mm.
And he referenced an incident where a journalist colleague had told him of an incident where McManaman had shouted at Evans over a decision. I'm not sure exactly why. So, were there other stories like this going around?
Yeah, yeah. There were at the time, and subsequently, some of the players have talked about them, haven't they? So there's like, I think Stan Collymore talked about like incidents where Robbie Fowler gets Roy Evans in a headlock and ruffles his hair or something. And there were stories at the time of players parking in Roy Evans's parking space at the training ground or at Anfield. So the illusion was that he lacked authority. How much of that's true, I don't know. I mean, also there was talk, wasn't there, that John Barnes had too big an influence in terms of training and tactics at the time. And yeah, Roy Evans is and was a really nice guy. Yeah, that kind of is true. But I don't know. I don't know if I think like if I think about how he dispensed with quite a lot of players who were big names, who had big egos initially, he wouldn't have been able to do that if he was this soft touch that he was portrayed as. But I think he possibly had a little bit too much loyalty to certain players. As time wore on, that loyalty wasn't repaid. And yeah, there are stories that he perhaps didn't have as great authority as maybe some of his predecessors. And certainly when Houllier became the manager, one of his first acts was to bring Phil Thompson in as his assistant, who he talks basically again in another of Simon's books that he saw his roles to be the disciplinarian and to kind of break up some of the player power that was prevalent in the dressing room at the time. So that speaks to some of that, doesn't it? I think there were stories that he was perhaps a little bit lacking in authority.
After so many years, what is his status with Liverpool faithful?
Yeah, I think he's like largely regarded as a good manager. Everybody in general has positive things to say about Roy Evans. His enthusiasm, his passion, his love for Liverpool can't be questioned. I think in terms of his managerial tenure, it's unfortunate that he will be seen, I think, as something of a nearly man, kind of a good manager. But what Liverpool probably needed at that time was a talismanic kind of era defining manager. And ultimately, I don't think he was quite that. He wasn't maybe at the level that, say, certainly Ferguson, Wenger, he perhaps wasn't at their level. I think his love for Liverpool and his kind of his story means that like sort of he's well regarded by most Liverpool fans.
Yeah, and in a way, he's the last link to the boot room and to an old era. And
Yeah,
because Gerard Houllier was a reference point of the modern era of Liverpool managers.
yeah. I mean that's true, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because one of the things we sort of talked about at the outset and in the previous podcast about Souness, Gerard Houllier basically came in and implemented a lot of the things that Graham Souness was trying to do in the early 90s. And they were just sort of accepted by that point, really. So, yeah, Roy Evans' legacy is, as I say, that of probably the nearly man. But the side that we produced at that time on our day were capable of beating anybody. But we just had this horrible tendency to throw in the odd sort of gutless performance. And obviously, you can't really win league titles with those kinds of tendencies. So, yeah, he'll be seen, I think, as the nearly man, really.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information is listed on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Chris, thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on Liverpool football history.
Yeah, thanks, Shahan. Really enjoyed it. And we're going to obviously focus on 96, 97 in more detail. So, yeah, I'll look forward in the main to that as well. Might be hard around the April time of that season, but yeah, thank you very much for your time today. Cheers.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you.